The various summer showcases really gave us a ton of games to get excited about. One of the standouts for me was 007 First Light, which IO Interactive had previously announced a handful of years ago. For those who don't know, First Light will be handled by the developers behind the Hitman series, but
no more foreplay.
Let's get into my wishlist for what will make 007 First Light the top-tier game it needs to be. If I were to ask you to name the first thing that comes to mind when I mention James Bond, what would it be? Let me know in the comments. For me, there are two key things that come to mind: the gadgets and the very cheeky, often sardonic British humor. We'll be covering the gadgets later on in the video, so keep watching. But why am I bringing up the so-called Bondian sense of humor? With a few exceptions, the actors who have played Bond previously have always been great at delivering cutting one-liners. This was most obvious during Roger Moore's 7-film tenure. Moore was so good at delivering these one-liners, you could almost do a supercut of it if Amazon MGM wouldn't issue a copyright strike in the process. The exceptions to the sense of humor would be actors like Timothy Dalton and Daniel Craig, whose portrayals of Bond were much grittier. Admittedly, these were in response to the types of movies that were the style at the time. Some will point to the original Bond, Sean Connery, being on the more serious side, but the actor did establish what would become Bond's sardonic wit. He just wasn't as campy about it as, say, Roger Moore or Pierce Brosnan, which is funny when you consider Brosnan's first stab at the character was grittier and more serious than his next handful of outings, but I digress. What I'm trying to establish is Bond has always been a somewhat funny and at times campy character, at least when it comes to his cinematic outings. The original writings of Ian Fleming for the short stories and full-blown Bond novels were always more serious affairs. It's clear the people at IO Interactive are massive fans of the James Bond property, as they have included the scar on Bond's cheek, which we've only seen mentioned in the novel continuity before. I'm of course confident IO Interactive will showcase the Bondian humor, as we got glimpses of it in the trailer, especially when Bond brings up the teachable moments line. I believe my second wish will come true, but for the sake of the video, I do have to state it. I really want this game to have a character-driven narrative. Pieces of James Bond media are always at their best when the titular spy is a deconstruction of the fears of the time. During the tenures of Sean Connery, John Lazenby, and Roger Moore, the major fears at the time were the Soviets, nuclear holocaust, and other such things. Those were still fears during Timothy Dalton's 2-film tenure too, but the fears were changing. You really see it during Pierce Brosnan's era, since the Soviets were no longer a threat as of GoldenEye's release in 1994. Brosnan's Bond focused more on technology, businessmen, and North Korea as the big bads of the time, which was actually the case. While those topics were addressed in each era, they weren't exactly the most character-driven adventures. That distinction belongs more to Daniel Craig's interpretation of the character, as his era, lasting from 2006 until 2021, was mostly focused on terrorism and other such topics, which were poignant in a post-9/11 world. But stylistically, all of the Craig-era films are essentially character pieces that are meant to deconstruct not just the mythos of the character James Bond, but also deconstruct the whole spy thriller genre as a whole. This is something I hope 007 First Light will do as well. For a lot of my longtime viewers, that will probably come as a surprise, despite my loving story-driven games like The Legend of Heroes and some others that do have a clearly character-driven narrative. I'm also rather critical of this type of storytelling in games. Just look at my video discussing the idea of cinematic games being boring. I will be covering why 007 First Light is cinematic gaming done right in a separate video, so subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss it when it goes live. But why do I think IO Interactive should make First Light a character-driven narrative? Simply put, it's because they could use First Light as a vehicle to poke fun not just the whole spy thriller genre of media, but they could also deconstruct a lot of gaming tropes too. Circling back to the Roger Moore era, that was something those 7 films were really good at doing, since they deconstructed some of the other popular TV and film tropes of the time. This is something I hope IO Interactive will achieve with First Light, as we really need more games that look not just at trends in games, but also the tropes and flip them on their head. James Bond is probably the perfect character to do this with, since the film Bonds are a reflection of their time. As of right now, IO Interactive plans to make this series a trilogy. I hope they will give us far more than that, since you can always use Bond to tell whatever kind of story you want to. But I'll be covering this more in a separate video that'll dive deep into James Bond's video game history as a whole, and explore how we've never really had a definitive Bond video game. Our closest to date was GoldenEye on the N64. While that was a huge moment in gaming and revolutionized the industry, it wasn't intended as that, and Rare were just making a game that was intended to be fun and as a showcase of what Nintendo's 5th generation hardware was capable of. Anyways, I've waffled on about this particular point enough. What are some of my other wishes? Another thing I think of when I look at James Bond films is the globe-trotting nature of said films. This is something IO Interactive is going to have to 100% capture with this game. And from the brief trailer that we got, I imagine this is going to be the case, because it mentions Iceland and shows off a snowy landscape. I imagine that is going to be the very first mission, and will be used for the tutorial section. Effectively, it will be like the cold open sequences we've come to know from the films. This particular Bondian trope started with 1963's From Russia with Love, which was the second of Connery's films. I know a lot of people will liken this to the Uncharted games, as they also borrow this particular trope. But this is a trope in adventure storytelling for a reason.
All of this just works.
Anyways, I believe this is going to be a thing in the game anyways, since the trailer gave us so many different locations to explore, ranging from humdrum England to the frosty wastelands to a tropical paradise. While I know this is going to be part of the game, I still want to see it. But let's get on to the gadgets. My Roger Moore fanboy is showing again, but one thing I 100% want to see is a lot of varied gadgets with a lot of upgrade paths. IO Interactive have been very upfront about the fact First Light is going to have some shared DNA with the Hitman games, in that you can tackle the missions in either a stealthy or loud manner. This is one area where the gadgets are not only going to be very transformative experiences, but also integral to the game as a whole. For me, James Bond's appeal is thanks to the techie gadgets he gets from Q. While I do love the Daniel Craig era films, thanks to Casino Royale being the first Bond film I actually enjoyed, the gadgets did take a back seat for the most part, which you can totally do in a film. However, with a video game, you really need to have some extra spice to the recipe if you want the game to actually be interesting.
Tell me when I'm telling lies!
Since IO Interactive has stated you can replay missions and do them differently, the gadgets will help that out. But what if they make it so you can modify the gadgets further for a more custom experience? I think that could be an excellent idea. Other franchises have messed around with this idea too. For example, older Ratchet & Clank games had the ability to mod the weapons to your liking. Insomniac has since done away with this and streamlined the process. However, fans of Ratchet & Clank have been asking for this feature to return in some capacity. While it is a lot of coding for a very minor thing, this would actually be a really interesting inclusion. While it's always satisfying to get upgrades to your items in-game, it's infinitely more so if you can actually customize it to your liking, since it just leads to a more tailored experience. But is there anything else I hope this game will include? Normally, I advocate just for single-player experiences, since that is what I enjoy the most. However, for a franchise like Bond, a multiplayer aspect just makes way too much sense. Just look at how GoldenEye's multiplayer mode revolutionized console gaming. While the inclusion of multiplayer would no longer be revolutionary, it doesn't have to be. It just has to be functional and be fun, which I believe First Light is capable of. While the inclusion of multiplayer was an afterthought for Uncharted 2 and 3, those games had some unique modes and were in general a fun time, which is something IO Interactive 100% could do. Also considering First Light has a lot of similarities with the Uncharted games from the snippets of gameplay we do have, a multiplayer mode in that vein could actually add a lot of value onto a game that is more than likely going to cost $80 American at launch. With the rising costs of games being passed on to the consumer, developers are going to have to get creative with how they offer more value to said consumer. Multiplayer is just one way they could do this. Will it work with every IP? Nope, but something like First Light is almost tailor-made for it. I just can't think of any specific game modes I'd like to see, just that a multiplayer experience for this game also tickles my fancy. But these were just the 5 things I most want to see in 007 First Light. What are some things you'd like to see in the game? Now check out my video on why cinematic games are boring, and until next time, keep blazing that trail, and order a martini, shaken, not stirred.